George A. Romero is truly on the very top tier when it comes to horror royalty, and likewise so is the director's 1968 Night of the Living Dead, a film that is one of the most influential in all of horror. Heck, it's a film that is one of the most influential in all of cinema, period. Of course, Night of the Living Dead is the movie that popularized zombies, or ghouls as they're known here. As for the plot, well, it's all pretty basic, yet all pretty brilliant. Strangers Ben and Barbara find themselves seeking shelter in a farmhouse after escaping a run-in with these flesh-eating ghouls. With a family of 3 and a young couple already hiding in the basement, what ensues is a power struggle as tensions run high, all as more ghouls continue to gather outside. But how well do you really know this absolute classic? With that in mind, I'm Andrew from What Culture Horror, and here are 10 things you didn't know about Night of the Living Dead. Well, probably. Number 10, the remakes. For reasons we'll get into a little later, the original 1968 Night of the Living Dead has generated countless remakes, most of which fall into unofficial tribute territory. The biggest of these remakes came in 1990. Not only did the legendary Tom Savini direct this redo, but George A. Romero himself wrote the screenplay, delivering a more contemporary spin on his original film. Added to that, some of the crew of the original movie were involved as well, plus the late great Tony Todd took on the Ben role this time out. One other notable remake was Night of the Living Dead 3D in 2006, which at least tried something new by adding new characters, such as the iconic Sid Haig as Gerald Tovar Jr. Still, this one did feel like little more than a simple cash grab with a big old gimmick slapped on it. 2009, that brought Night of the Living Dead Reanimated, which was essentially a love letter to Romero's original, with artists from all over the world coming together, and working for free it should be added, to animate the film with claymation, CGI, puppets and traditional animation, all under the audio from the 1968 movie. Hey, and as a Welshman myself, I couldn't not make mention of Night of the Living Dead Resurrection, which is a loose retelling filmed in and around Cardiff and Swansea. Then there's Night of the Living Dead Origins and Night of the Animated Dead, which, to be honest, the less said about those two, the better. Number 9. Issues with the 30th Anniversary Edition. While people rightly think of George A. Romero when thinking of Night of the Living Dead, another pivotal part of the picture is John Russo, who co-wrote the film, had a brief cameo in it, and was also a producer on Savini's 1990 remake. When it comes to the 30th Anniversary Edition of Night of the Living Dead, it was Russo who re-edited the film, cutting out 15 minutes and adding in 15 minutes of new footage he directed, plus featuring a whole new soundtrack. Problems arose though before filming could even start, with the Evans City Cemetery, where the original movie was shot, ravaged by a tornado which made the site unusable. When things did get underway, actor and composer Scott Vladimir Likini was hospitalized with heat stroke. Yep, that 30th Anniversary Edition has a certain sense of infamy to it, not helped by some awful acting in those new scenes. Number 8. The financial success. Night of the Living Dead sure is a movie that made the absolute most of its budget, with Romero and his team managing to put this masterpiece together for around $125,000, including using chocolate sauce for blood and using real entrails from a slaughterhouse for the gore. As for the farmhouse scene in the film, that was set for demolition and so was available to rent on the cheap. From that $125,000 budget, Night of the Living Dead brought home a staggering $30 million at the box office. However, George A. Romero saw hardly any of that profit. You see, when changing the film's title from Night of the Flesh Eaters to Night of the Living Dead, somebody, some silly scamp, forgot to put the copyright notice on the new title screen, meaning the film wasn't copyright protected, and that theatrical distributors, they hovered up nearly all of the profits. Number 7. Tom Savini's absence. Tom Savini is one of, if not the greatest makeup artist in the history of cinema, period, having done stunning work on the likes of Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Martin, the Creepshow movies, the Friday the 13th franchise, Maniac, The Burning, The Prowler, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Obviously, in addition to directing, amongst other things, the 1990 Night of the Living Dead remake. However, one film Savini did not work on was Night of the Living Dead, despite having agreed to join Romero on that picture. The reason for this is that Savini was deployed to Vietnam as a war photographer for the US Army. Tom Savini may have missed out on Night of the Living Dead, but he credits his time in Vietnam and the horrific sights he saw with shaping how realistic and visceral his work then looked later. Number 6. The Novelisation and its sequel. It was John Russo himself who wrote the Night of the Living Dead tie-in novel, and he also wrote a 1977 sequel to that novel called Return of the Living Dead. Not to be confused, of course, with the 1985 Return of the Living Dead movie, although to make things confusing, that was also written by Russo. The sequel novel, that takes place a decade after Night of the Living Dead, with humans having successfully fought back against the undead. While the local reverend insists still on putting a spike through the head of the recently deceased, this is something that the local sheriff disapproves of. Of course, it turns out the reverend is right, as following a fatal bus crash, the sheriff stops any heads from being spiked, which, surprise, surprise, leads to the dead rising once again. Away from that, the story follows the pregnant Karen and her sister, trying to survive with the help of state troopers and some prisoners they were transporting. It's not exactly an all-time classic, but Return of the Living Dead, it's a nice dollop of horror fun. Number 5. The I Am Legend influence. For George A. Romero, he cited Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend as being a major influence on Night of the Living Dead. That novel sees Robert Neville adapt into a world in which he might be the last living human. As marauding vampires, they rule the night, and Neville, he has to barricade himself into the house he's turned into a fortress. Essentially, it's the blueprint for any future zombie apocalypse. The influence on Night of the Living Dead, that becomes even clearer when watching the first adaptation of I Am Legend, which would be 1964's The Last Man on Earth with the magnificent Vincent Price. Yeah, you can keep your Will Smith, I will forever take Vincent Price all day, every day. Number 4. George A. Romero's feature-length directorial debut. He may have gone on to direct Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, and Survival of the Dead, not to mention the likes of Creepshow, The Crazies, and Martin, but it all very much began for George A. Romero's directing career with Night of the Living Dead. Until that point, Romero mainly worked on commercials and industrial training and safety videos, something that would actually come in pretty handy for amusement park years later. But Night of the Living Dead, that was his very first feature-length directing gig. Romero had worked on the set of Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, but he was highly critical of what he labelled the passionless and mechanical style of Hitchcock. Number 3. Social commentary was not the original plan. The Living Dead franchise is one brimming with social commentary, whether that's reckless consumerism in Dawn of the Dead or the danger military authoritarianism poses in Day of the Dead. However, Night of the Living Dead's themes of social issues were unintentional, at least to begin with. The ghouls of Night of the Living Dead are corpses reanimated by radiation from a fallen satellite, a clear subtext of the fear around the Cold War and the arms race between the USA and the Soviet Union. The film also addresses domestic racism and civil rights tensions, with many presuming that's why a black man was given the heroic lead for the very first time in horror history. That wasn't the case though, for the character of Ben was written with no race in mind. As Romero's later said, Dwayne Jones had the best audition and was the best man for the job. Night of the Living Dead and George A. Romero are often praised for highlighting the racial tensions of the time, but the bulk of that credit, that absolutely belongs to Dwayne Jones. Number 2. Various Colourisations. 1986 saw Hal Roach colorize Night of the Living Dead, with that becoming a hugely popular VHS for the next decade or more. In fact, that first colorization, the ghouls there, they had flat green skin that added a surreal, almost alien-like spookiness to them. 1997 then saw Anchor Bay have a crack at the same thing, making the ghouls grey this time and perhaps a little more realistic, though this version was nowhere near as popular as the 86 one. Likewise, 2004 saw Legends Films and 20th Century Fox release yet another colorized version, which itself was followed 5 years later by a 3D colorized version, which actually made Night of the Living Dead the first live-action 2D movie to be completely converted to 3D. Number 1. The public domain. Ah yes, finally the public domain issue. The main reason why there are so many versions fans of Night of the Living Dead, as well as it being such an influential, iconic game changer of a movie, of course, is due to the previously mentioned copyright error. As a result of that, Night of the Living Dead is in the public domain, as in it belongs to the public, to me, to you, free of copyright laws. That public domain status means that the original cast and crew lost out on a bunch of box office profits and royalties, though for horror fans it means the film has become widely available and can be seen for free online, which has no doubt helped Night of the Living Dead achieve such a big following, with it one of the most watched horror movies of all time. TV stations can use the film whenever they want, aspiring artists can use the footage for free, and likewise they can do the same with the soundtrack. Night of the Living Dead is likely the easiest horror film on the planet to access, so for those who have never seen it, there is absolutely no excuse whatsoever. And with that, I'm off to obviously start work on my own Night of the Living Dead remake.